Welcome to the interview series for Women in Defence and Security Network. My name is Kwesi Kwanyana. I'm a research intern here at ASPI, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tegan Westendorf, an analyst for strategic policing at Northern Australia's Strategic Policy Centre. To begin, Tegan, can you just tell us a little bit of background about the research that you're doing here in ASPI and how you wound up here?
Absolutely. So I've ended up in the think tank world after quite a few years in academia, teaching political science, did a PhD in law, and then did a couple of years in policy in Victoria, and then found myself in the think tank world because I was really attracted to the idea of a middle ground between those two places. So academia was wonderful, and the freedom of that kind of research was amazing, but I found myself wanting to sort of get in the game, get a bit to the front of where things were really happening. And then when I was in policy, I sort of really missed being able to do that kind of like deep dive research into interesting questions. So I really enjoy think tank life for that middle ground, yeah.
Excellent. And when you were in academia and policy, were you dealing directly with national security?
At times, my academic research looked at military policing in Iraq. Whereas my policy research was actually more in, was more in health and human services. So, for example, I worked for the Victorian Peak Body for Aboriginal Health. So it was a bit of a long and winding journey to find myself here, but this is where I've been aiming to get, so I'm really pleased.
Excellent. And could you tell us a little bit more about the research that you do here at ASPI and how your background helps?
Absolutely. So it's pretty broad ranging, which is one of the reasons that I enjoy it so much. For the Northern Australia Centre, we take the approach of that a socioeconomically prosperous north is a secure one. I really enjoy how broad that remit is. So I've been able to do research and write on youth justice and youth crime. And then tomorrow we're going to be releasing a report on the Darwin Port, which is much more sort of directly in that national security space. So it's really fun having so much space to range in that portfolio. On the policing side of things, I've been writing a fair bit on right-wing extremism and the changes to the way ASIO looks at violent extremist groups in Australia.
So just launching off your work with right-wing extremism, could you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in that space?
Absolutely. So my most recent piece was looking at Biden's new domestic terrorism strategy and thinking about what are the key learnings for Australia in that space. And I think one of the really exciting ones is the way that the Biden administration has really run with the idea of prevention and community resilience in a way that I think Australia really should as well. So by that I mean looking at practical initiatives of digital literacy. For example, in Australia, we have a real high incidence of young people being radicalised, according to ASIO. So I think that it provides a lot of endpoints for policymakers in Australia thinking, well, how can we foster greater resilience among those at-risk communities? And perhaps for us that would be, using high schools and bachelor degrees as already available institutional pathways where that kind of resilience programming can be included. And I really liked the way that the US is looking at it in terms of that success should be measured in a reduction in the threat as opposed to in the number of threats that don't result in blood on the ground effectively.
Mm-hmm. And could you speak further on connecting your research to policy and advocating for policy change, whether that be within the think tank space or your previous history doing that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Look, this is really what I love about the think tank world. When I was in academia, I had, unending freedom to write about what I wanted to. And working at ASPI means that every time I want to research something, the first thing I think is, well, why is this a worthy question? And how can this actually be involved? How can this affect change? So what's this really contributing to? And personally, I just find it really fulfilling knowing that things that I write are hopefully one small piece of a broader sort of push for change in particular areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you there as well, especially because I think when you're either in policy or the education field, you don't feel like you are enacting real change. You're part of the governments of the day or academia of the day. So I think in a think tank space, you're allowed that opportunity to think critically about issues and what you think are the solutions.
Absolutely.
And advocating that. Yeah.
And I have to say, like, I think that academia really does that as well. It's just you don't get the gratification as often. I think that it's part of this incredibly critical, broader movement, intellectual movement that supports policy change ultimately. But when you're working in academia, you don't so often get to talk about applied policy recommendations that could be implemented tomorrow or that could make a change tomorrow. You're working on the huge basis that's needed to then do work on those policy recommendations and say what really, thinking strategically in that moment about what do we now need to do to make change. So it's a much longer game, I guess. And I think it can feel a bit more like a thankless task in the meantime.
And I think it's fair to say that you're working in fields that are quite predominantly male dominated, whether that be policing, law enforcement, even extremism. How do you navigate that space, and have you encountered any barriers?
It's a really great question. It's definitely something that I think about. I try to keep my guiding logic as that the most important thing about me is my brain and what I can do with it, and that I'll be judged based on my merit. That's how I like to keep a really positive outlook and stay focused on my work. I'll definitely admit that I'm aware of my gender and that it means that I navigate that space with more caution than I imagine my male counterparts might. It can sometimes be tempting to be a little bit too cautious. I think at the moment I'm sort of in not my early career anymore, and I'm trying to find a middle ground between not being naive but also not worrying too much about that, and trying to get better at, putting my elbows out and kicking the door down and just really focusing on what I'm there to deliver through being a really great researcher.
Do you ever shift the focus away from you being a minority to rather that is your strength? So you're in a very male-dominated field, you can offer backgrounds and solutions that maybe male counterparts don't think about.
That's such a wonderful question. Look, I really hope so, and I like to think so. And I think that all I need to do is look around me at the incredible women that I see in this space who are younger than me, my age, and older than me, and I see that in what they do. And so I hope I'm part of that as well.
Excellent. And is there any women in particular that inspires you in your work every day?
There's lots of women that I know who do. I have a personal and professional hero, I guess, called, who I unfortunately don't know, but if I ever got that question of who you could go back and have dinner with, it would be her. Hannah Arendt, who is just a really wonderful critical theorist. And I really admire her work, and maybe just a little takeaway from her in terms of being personally inspiring. Despite being such an incredibly successful academic, she never accepted a tenure track position anywhere, even though, from what I understand, all the Ivy League schools in America wanted her. And I took that to mean that, her worth was not to be dictated by any institution that she was affiliated with. She seemed to really trust that she was what was valuable. And I think that that's something that, as women in this space and more broadly, that's something we might not be taught as much as our male counterparts. And I try to remember that what I can bring is worthy.
That's excellent. And you, just to finish it off, what advice would you give women either entering the field, currently in the field, about your takeaways in this space?
I guess a summary of what we've just spoken about, that you have incredible strengths. One of our colleagues, Lisa Sharland, actually, I think, spoke about women as being a force multiplier. And I need to think that through a bit more, but I really like that idea in terms of the diversity of perspective that's brought to the table by women of colour, by different types of diversity is always an asset. And it's not just something that we do because it's the right thing to do and because it's fair. It's better for us as individuals and collectives and organisations. So I would just say, you've got nothing but strengths to bring to the table, and just don't forget that, because it can be easy to get caught up in the little things that feel like a little thorn in your side, but there's much bigger things at stake, and they're things you can win.
I think that's a beautiful way to finish it off and looking forward. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tegan.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Crazy.